Namaskar, I am Dr. Himanshu Bavishi from Bavishi Fertility Institute, and today we will talk about whether we should do fresh embryo transfer or we should freeze all the embryos and do an elective freeze all cycle, or which is sometimes known as segmented IVF. Freezing the extra embryos and using them to achieve pregnancy is a common practice since years, and that is still continuing. There is nothing new about it. But a new concept came in that rather than putting the embryos when they are fresh, we freeze all the embryos which are produced in the cycle, let the period come, let the ovaries rest, become normal, then prepare the endometrium and then transfer the embryos which were frozen. In other words, when we actually do the IVF, when we actually do the oocyte collection or egg collection, fertilization, embryo creation, we don't transfer the embryos back into the uterus and freeze all the embryos and transfer the embryos only when the ovaries have become normal or quiescent. Then the question comes that when, as a standard practice, we are doing IVF, we are creating embryos, we are transferring the embryos in fresh cycle and freezing the extra embryos, why did the concept of not transferring the fresh embryo, freezing all the embryos came in? The logic was that when you are stimulating the ovaries, a lot of hormones are produced, and that creates hyperestrogenic state in the body and a little bit of hormone imbalance which is not there in a normal cycle. So if you put the embryos back at that particular time, the endometrium may not be as receptive as it may be in a normal cycle where the embryo is getting a hormone balanced environment. And that is where we freeze the embryos, let the hormones settle, let the hormone become normal or close to the natural cycle, and then transfer the embryos. The advantage, I said, that the hormone levels are normal and we might get a better pregnancy chance. There was one more risk. The real risk in IVF is called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. That you do a fresh embryo transfer, what happens is that you have stimulated the ovaries, once you give trigger, you stop stimulation and then the ovaries regress. But if you put the embryos back, there can be a pregnancy, the pregnancy can produce the hormones and those hormones can again stimulate the ovary and may produce what is called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So if you freeze all the embryos, we practically eliminate the risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, particularly the late or delayed ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So these were the two advantages for which the freeze all strategy became popular. But every advantage has disadvantage as well. The major disadvantage is that, number one, you have to freeze the embryos in spite of the fact that you could transfer them. So an embryo which is at plus 37 degree temperature, you put it back or freeze it at minus 196 degrees temperature, and when you use it from minus 196 degrees, you bring it back to plus 37 degrees. So there is going to be some stress caused to the embryos which is inevitable, number one. Number two, there is an additional cost of freezing the embryos, thawing the embryos and using them. So the cost definitely increases. Number three, you don't transfer the embryos in fresh cycle. So you wait for the period, then prepare the endometrium, then do the transfer. Sometimes the ovaries may take 2 months to become normal, and then it takes too much of long time to finish the cycle which could have been finished in the same cycle. So you waste lot of time. So all these disadvantages versus the advantage of normal hormonal milieu has to be evaluated, and a prudent judgment is to be done as to whether to do fresh transfer or not. Whereas if you do the fresh embryo transfer in the same cycle when you have done the ovarian stimulation, pick up, created embryos and do the transfer, your treatment finishes in the same cycle. Number two, you get the result in the same cycle. You don't spend money for freezing, thaw cycle, and at the same time there is no stress of freezing and thawing on the embryos. The embryos are fresh. So what you get is fresh embryos and you get a better pregnancy chance. So then how do we decide which patient needs freeze all, which patient needs fresh embryo transfer? And that is decided on multiple factors. Number one, the condition of the ovaries, the hormone imbalance in the patient, the risk of ovarian hyperstimulation, the preference of the patient, convenience of the patient, and multiple other things. But most important deciding point would be the safety of the patient and success chance of the patient. And based on this, individualized decision has to be taken in an individual patient. A blind following of freeze-all protocol adds up to a lot of inconvenience, cost and disadvantages as well. So blindly following freeze-all for every patient is definitely not a good policy. And even in recent meta-analysis, that's a huge research database, is proven that if the number of eggs recovered in that particular cycles is not too high, there is practically no risk of hyperstimulation, and the success rate of freeze-all versus fresh embryo transfer also remains the same. That means there is no risk and the success chance is same. All other advantages of fresh embryo transfers are there. So you choose a clinic which does not blindly follow freeze-all protocol but wisely follows whether you are good candidate for fresh embryo transfer or you need freeze-all. And so far as Bavishi Fertility Institute is concerned, we have done a big research of last 10 years. We have our own criteria to decide which patient is a good candidate for fresh embryo transfer and which is not. And based on that, we offer the best outcome in a particular treatment cycle, customized to the needs and situation of an individual patient. So safe IVF with successful IVF is our motto: simple, safe, smart, successful. Thank you for watching this video. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.